Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Peter Knox. I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve University, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this year's Walter A. Strauss Lectures. This series honors a teacher and a scholar whose intellectual passions reflect this university's long and distinguished tradition in the humanities. Walter Strauss was born in Mannheim, Germany in 1923, and he came to the US in the late 1930s. He joined the faculty of CWRU in 1970 as the first Elizabeth and Walter C. Treuhaft Professor of Humanities in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. A revered and award-winning teacher, after his retirement and until his death in 2008, Professor Strauss continued to offer courses and seminars both at the university and in his home that attracted numerous and devoted students and faculty. This lecture series is made possible by the endowment established by Paul Wurzburger, a longtime resident of Cleveland. He and his wife Odette were strong advocates for the arts and generous benefactors of this university. The endowment Paul Wurzburger established makes possible the Walter A. Strauss Lectureship in the Humanities and commemorates Professor Strauss's lasting contribution to the goals Wurzburger cherished. This year marks a new phase in the Strauss Lectures, which will now take the form of a series of presentations on topics in the humanities of broad interest to the academic community and the public. The lectures will eventually be published by Oxford University Press in a series that will honor the legacy of Walter Strauss and highlight the centrality of the humanities at Case Western Reserve University. And what could be more timely as a topic for the first series than the role of education in a democracy, as examined by our distinguished guest, Philip Kitcher. He comes to us from Columbia University, where he has been a member of the Department of Philosophy since 1998. Over the course of his career, the focus of his scholarship has broadened from an early interest in the philosophy of biology to inquire into the role of scientific inquiry in democratic societies, such as the one the one we still live in. His work is most closely identified, you can absorb that. His work is most closely identified with the pragmatism associated with William James and John Dewey, and appropriately enough, he has been recognized by his home institution as the John Dewey Professor of Philosophy. Professor Kitcher's expansive view of the role of philosophy in life extends to his interests in literature, which include James Joyce and Thomas Mann, the subject of a recent book entitled Deaths in Venice, The Cases of Gustav von Aschenbach. Other recent publications include Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism, a challenging critique of traditional religious beliefs. And just this year, The Seasons Alter, How to Save the Human Future in 6 Acts, together with Evelyn Fox Keller, which models the kinds of conversations that we need to have and to have soon, if not now, about our changing climate. We may need to bring Philip back to Cleveland for the 2019 Cleveland Humanities Festival on the theme of nature. This evening, in the first of 3 lectures, Professor Kitcher takes on the critical first question in addressing the role of education in a democratic society. That is, what are our goals? And in the seemingly endless proliferation of potentially conflicting responses to that question, how do we reconcile them in a way that works for society and the individual? Are there too many aims, as he asks in the title of his presentation? Please join me in welcoming this year's Walter A. Strauss lecturer, Professor Philip Kitcher.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sorry, there's no short way to get up onto this stage. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here and to give these lectures. And I've had a very enjoyable, stimulating, and rewarding time thinking about education and democracy today. And I'd like to share these thoughts with you. I'm looking forward to developing them further, and I'm looking forward to conversation with you. And I'm going to begin with an epigraph from a great American thinker, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's old-fashioned language. By man, he doesn't mean biologically male human being. He means any human being, a man or a woman. So Emerson says in his famous address, The American Scholar, "The main enterprise of the world for splendor, for extent, is the upbuilding of a man." So, in 1867, 2 years after the students at St. Andrews University in Scotland had elected him as their rector, John Stuart Mill took a break from his duties as a member of Parliament and travelled north to Scotland to deliver his inaugural address. Mill began by alluding with approval to the custom of using the occasion to offer what he called a few thoughts on the subject of liberal education. He continued, somewhat ominously, by remarking that education in its larger sense is one of the most inexhaustible of all topics. The speech lived up to his advertisement, for although he spoke quickly, Mill went on for more than 3 hours. I'm not sure how his audience reacted, but it seems a safe bet to suppose that the undergraduates found him less entertaining than their successors who listened just over a century later to their choice as rector, the celebrated British comedian and silly walker John Cleese. Now, the text of Mill's address provokes a suspicion that, like Topsy, it just growed. Early on, Mill made it clear how some kinds of education were beyond his intended scope. Professional training has no place in his thoughts. So there's something left out. To be sure, there should be schools of law, medicine, and engineering, but these don't belong to the project of general education to which universities ought to be dedicated. Instead, Mill began with the question, disputed then as now, of the relative role of the humanities and the sciences in a general education. He proposed to settle the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, the defenders of classical learning and the champions of natural science, by awarding prizes to both sides. The writings of antiquity in the original Greek and Latin maintain their great importance. Study of them should be streamlined so as to allow a thorough immersion in mathematics and the physical sciences, both theoretical and experimental. Moreover, the understanding of the principal features of astronomy, physics, and chemistry ought to be supplemented with appreciation of the general ways in which the sciences infer their conclusions from the evidence. The rules of deductive logic and those of non-deductive inference must be studied and assimilated. At this point, perhaps after some further remarks about how all this might be managed, Mill might have stopped. He didn't. Apparently, his parliamentary work had impressed him with the need for public understanding of various issues, in particular policies of hygiene. So his next step expands the scientific curriculum to embrace the study of physiology. Most people, he suggests, will be required to form an opinion and to take action on sanitary subjects. Moreover, the science of the laws of organic and animal life provides a bridge to studies of even greater significance. Following Pope, Mill takes the proper study of mankind to be man. But the requirements of general education have to be expanded even further. An encounter with psychology is essential. And here, Mill inserts a plug for the ability of philosophy, epistemology in particular, to sharpen the intellectual faculties. Most of all, students need instruction in the exercise of thought on the great interests of mankind as moral and social beings. Now, subject upon subject comes flooding in. History, conceived generally or philosophically, should provide some incipient conception of the causes and laws of progress. Political science should acquaint the young with the civil and political institutions of their own country and of others as well. Political economy is crucial for understanding the economic constraints on well-intentioned policies. Jurisprudence is of no less importance, but it should be supplemented by some study of international law. Yet none of these crucial educational domains can be expected to yield its proper fruits unless there's serious attention to ethics. Mill's ideal curriculum requires a thorough and impartial survey of, quote, the principal systems of moral philosophy, supplemented with a comparative and historical study of the major world religions. At this point, somewhat past the 2-hour mark, Mill announced that he had now said what he had to say on the debate with which he had started, probably arousing the hopes of his audience. But he was not ready to stop. He added a defense of the arts. The fine arts, he suggested, cultivate exalted feelings, raising people above the littlenesses of humanity and offering them insight into subjects larger and far more ennobling than the minutiae of a business or a profession. A deep immersion in the arts complements the other branches of education, thereby helping people to discharge a fundamental human duty. Each of us is to leave his fellow creatures a little better for the use he has known how to make of his intellect. The promise of education is to provide a deeper and more varied interest in life. Unlike other rewards, our sense of making a contribution to the lives of others will not grow less valuable as we age. Instead, it not only endures, but increases. On this high note, Mill ended. An amusing Victorian pathology, the fantasies of an over-earnest intellectual force-fed by a father who had started him on Greek at 3, the apologia of someone whose brilliance had been clouded by a nervous breakdown in early adulthood, from which he had recovered through reading the poetry of Wordsworth. The demands of this apparently preposterous address are to be explained away partly as products of past social conditions, partly as idiosyncrasies of an extraordinarily articulate member of an elite class. So at least you might think. If you're tempted to think that, I hope to convince you that you're wrong. Behind Mill's peroration stands a complex of forces even more intense today than they were a century ago. And that pushes him to multiply requirements beyond credibility. He's moved by a conception, part tacit, part explicit, of what education in its larger sense is meant to accomplish, for the individual and for the society of which that individual is a part. Anyone who tries to understand and to amend the practice of education by asking after its proper aims will be forced to traverse the ground Mill attempted to cover. So let's start with the individual. What do we expect our educational practice to provide for the young? Many people would begin with the kinds of preparation Mill self-consciously left out, with training for the workaday world. Indeed, not only his omission of the skill needed to earn a living, but also the terms in which he characterized what didn't belong in his account, law, medicine, engineering, the professions, are easily seen as symptoms of the elitist insensitivity to the predicaments of the vast majority of human beings then as now. Our formal systems of education, manifest in schools and to a lesser extent in universities, should equip those who pass through them with the ability to earn a living. Generalizing slightly, I'll view one goal of education as instilling a capacity for self-maintenance. A second obvious goal is to enable those who have been schooled to live together within the society they inhabit. Education not only makes workers, but citizens as well. From the perspective of some societies, the crucial capacities may be those of understanding the existing framework of laws and institutions, and of being strongly opposed to abide by them and not to change them. Within others, including both the affluent democracies of today and the nations Mill clearly had in mind, education should acknowledge the possibility of progress, preparing the young to play their part in formulating and implementing policies that would improve the status quo. Citizens need a capacity for progressive participation in civic life. Would that be enough? Mill discerns a further aim. The elevated close of his address views education as directed towards personal fulfillment. The school, and perhaps even the university, should supply the resources for discovering the particular ways in which an individual human being can make a distinctive contribution to human life. To explore the underlying thought in the detail it deserves would take me too far from my central topic, and I'm going to reassure you I'm not going to go on for 3 hours. So I'm going to content myself with a simplifying sketch. Any serious investigation of education has to come to terms with the oldest problem of Western philosophy, Socrates' question: what makes a human life go well? The most influential contemporary answer was elaborated by Mill and his predecessors, the Enlightenment thinkers Immanuel Kant and Wilhelm von Humboldt. It's been continued in our times by many others, including John Rawls, Bernard Williams, and Susan Wolfe. It offers what I'm going to call the liberal approach. Liberals suppose that for a life to go well, its pattern must not be externally imposed. In Mill's famous phrase, the only freedom worthy of the name is to be able to choose one's own good and pursue it in one's own way. Those who live well find their own plan of life, a conception of what they aim to do, perhaps explicitly formulated, perhaps implicit in their everyday choices. If they go on to pursue that plan with some measure of success, we count them as having lived well. Not necessarily because they achieve something grand, something that makes a mark across the ages. The person whose life is devoted to nurturing and sustaining a family or a community, and whose efforts are largely rewarded, has had a good life. But not any old plan will do. Imagine someone who chooses, as freely as anyone ever does, to retreat to a remote region, forswearing all human contact and dedicating himself to counting and recounting the number of blades of grass it contains. Let the grass counter be completely successful in accurately numbering the blades and recording his findings. Nevertheless, his project appears pathological and his pursuit of it pathetic. He hasn't discovered a hitherto unappreciated answer to the question, how to live. So what's gone wrong? In discussing self-sacrifice, Mill provides a clue. Abnegating personal satisfactions for the sake of bringing good to other people, he explains, is rightly praised. To act similarly for any other purpose, however, is no more worthy of admiration than the conduct of the ascetic mounted on his pillar. To live well is to engage in activities that touch the lives of others, improving the lot of people, some of whom will live on when you have ceased to be. By doing so, you contribute to something bigger than yourself, something I'll call the human project. So the best version of the liberal approach, I think, starts with the autonomy condition. The life plan should be freely chosen, not thrust upon you. And the success condition, enough of the goals marked out by the life plan should be achieved. It adds a community condition. The plan of a valuable life must be intended to make a positive impact on the lives of others. The choice of plan involves awareness, explicit or at least implicit, of the chooser's community with other people. Community can be expressed in many different ways. Perhaps it consists in providing support or advice when others find themselves in difficult or confusing situations, or in participating in a shared endeavor, or in preserving and transmitting things the community finds valuable. There are many types of relations binding human communities together. The community condition acknowledges many kinds of other-directedness. It emphasizes that self-fulfillment always has an other-directed, a collective dimension. Now you might begin to see why the aims of education are so often disputed, why inclusive proposals like Mill's appear so absurdly ambitious, and why Mill took up so much of his audience's time. Considering education from the perspective of the individuals who are to be educated, there are three different goals. The young must develop capacities for sustaining themselves, for civic life, and for self-fulfillment. How should the goals be balanced? Is there some optimal distribution of emphases on each? Ought we to try, as Mill seems to recommend, for the maximal development of each capacity? That suggestion founders on the fact that all these capacities are matters of degree. However much an educational system might provide by way of preparation for sustaining people, for inculcating citizenship, or for self-fulfillment, it could always do more. Moreover, the components of self-fulfillment are themselves degreed notions. It's easy to compare the autonomy enjoyed by people who live under different social conditions. Think of the differences in women's abilities to make choices across historical times and across contemporary societies. But can we make any sense of perfect autonomy? Similarly, some of us are more successful than others in pursuing our goals. Given the ways in which achievements typically bring new ends for us to strive for, it's not clear what complete success would be. The notion of community is even more complex, since it has so many different dimensions. To the extent that sense can be made of maximal other-directedness on any single dimension, the problem of weighing the dimensions against one another remains. And you're all familiar with this problem. The counselor, the nurse, the healer, the builder, the judge, and the teacher, as well as the parent, the sibling, the child, and the friend, represent types of other-directedness. Each of us in our life plays many parts. We often struggle to balance different other-directed roles when they tug in different directions. And as a final twist, the autonomy and community conditions are in tension with one another. Societies allowing the richest forms of community typically support the projects pursued by their members, but they tend also to restrict the range of choices. All I've offered you is a sketch of a complex conceptual landscape, but I hope to have said enough to diagnose the conditions whose symptoms present themselves in Mill's long address. All the goals I've identified are valuable and important. There's no utopia to realize all of them. And it gets worse. So far, I've focused on what education might provide for the individual. But those who craft educational policy often think about what education could do for society. What's good for the nation isn't necessarily what's good for all its citizens. Policymakers want the nation to thrive. You don't have to venture far into history to recognize a wide range of conceptions of what thriving involves. Britain's destiny was once to rule the waves. Germany needed ports on the Baltic. And today, apparently, America needs to become great again. When ambitious goals are set, the workforce has to be trained to achieve them. Educational reform along these lines sometimes has happy consequences. I received an extraordinary education in mathematics, thanks to the efforts of Samuel Pepys, Isaac Newton, and other 17th century luminaries who decided to found the Royal Mathematical School so that the poor boys who attended Christ's Hospital might acquire the skills required to navigate the ships of the monarch's navy. But sometimes the emphasis on national productivity clashes with the aspirations of individuals. In past decades, South Korean children have consistently performed at the highest levels in international assessments of education, particularly in mathematics and in the sciences. South Korea's educational system is strikingly successful. At Seoul National University, the nation's premier institution of higher education, the space assigned to natural science is comparable to that given to engineering, and both dwarf the buildings housing humanities and the social sciences. even before you take into account the many institutes in a wide range of applied sciences. In their teens, South Korean adolescents experience an intensifying set of educational demands. As their school day extends into the evening, as many of them are enrolled in the shadow educational system, which extends it further, and as they prepare for the National University Entrance Examination, held on a single day that will determine where they go next and will quite possibly determine the course of their lives. The effects are well documented. Almost alone among 40 relatively affluent nations surveyed, more South Korean teenagers describe themselves as extremely unhappy than those who report being extremely happy. The rates of adolescent suicide are higher than those in most developed countries. So this is one way in which social goals can conflict with individual goals. And there are two others, which I won't talk about to keep this within manageable length. But there are two parallel social goals to the individual goals, and these two can come into conflict with the individual aspirations. So I've highlighted some sources of difficulty in identifying the aims of education. They lie in the difficulty of combining plausible ideals. How are the individual goals properly balanced? How are they integrated with national priorities? Now, if you're going to answer these questions, you have to start by recognizing the proper role of ideals. Ideals don't single out definite goals to be realized or at least approximated. Rather, they're diagnostic tools for identifying the problems of the present and the lines along which they might be overcome. As we've seen, it's impossible to combine all the goals Mill ascribes to the educational system into a single end. His various aims conflict with one another. It's perfectly appropriate to respond to the inaugural address by exclaiming, "How preposterous to imagine any educational could do all that." Yet it isn't so absurd to recognize Mill's laundry list of desiderata as pointing to places where existing educational practices are deficient. Recall the ambitious goals. Education should provide the educated individuals with a capacity for self-maintenance, with a capacity for progressive participation in civic life, and with a capacity for personal self-fulfillment. It should deliver to the society a workforce capable of sustaining that society, a group of citizens who are able to live harmoniously together, and people who can preserve and improve the society's culture. Reflecting on education as it currently works here in the United States, we can ask how well it performs on each of these dimensions, and the answers are sobering. Many young people emerge from our schools and even from places of higher education lacking the skills for the available jobs. Many of them are ill-equipped to reflect on the principal public issues of our day or to devote their efforts to progressive social change. For a significant number, the thought of autonomous choice of a life plan would be an insensitive, sick joke. Equally, many lack the social as well as the economic support required to pursue their chosen ends. In an increasingly competitive and atomized society, opportunities for genuine community with others are rare. The citizenry is divided, and our rancorous debates make a mockery of democratic decision-making through free and open discussion. More about that on Wednesday. Polarization extends to the cultural sphere and to passionate arguments about which features of our tradition should be preserved and which should be modified. Finally, the workforce available is widely taken to be inadequate, incapable of strengthening or even maintaining America's foremost position in the global economy. Even without any sophisticated reflection on the goals of education, this last deficiency has been publicly identified and a solution has been offered. Focus on science, STEM for the USA. Now, possibly a program giving greater emphasis to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics would be a promising solution to an urgent problem. But that can't be determined simply by focusing on one of the evident deficiencies of our current educational practice. The proposed remedies might swell the numbers of children who are marginalized by and alienated from the schools they are compelled to attend. It could force others into careers for which they are ill-suited, making even greater mockery of the idea of autonomous choice of a life plan. It could increase the competitiveness not only of education, but of social life, thus attenuating even further the prospects for democracy and for community. I talk here of possible negative effects. Neither confidence in STEM nor dismissal of it as educationally counterproductive is warranted. Without a systematic investigation of the aims of education, their interrelations and their connections to structural features of the world in which we now live, it's impossible to tell whether contemporary American education in science and mathematics is deficient, whether greater emphasis on these subjects would be overall a good thing, or whether other efforts at reform should be given greater priority. So, which educational problems are most urgent? How might they be overcome, or at least mitigated? Answering these questions is hard for two separate reasons. First, in our multifaceted society, different groups will rate the gravity of problems differently. Those concerned with a perceived threat to American economic dominance are often troubled by the disinclination of young people to pursue advanced study in the sciences. Parents who send their children to schools that are dilapidated and dangerous, where the teaching staff is constantly changing, and where the most basic equipment is in short supply, are more likely to demand transformation of a system seemingly indifferent to the alienation felt by so many of the young. Older parents, across the socioeconomic continuum, may regret the narrowing of vision they see in the structured, competitive lives thrust upon their children. With the advent of school, shades of the prison house really do begin to close upon the growing boy or the growing girl. The second difficulty, that of addressing the identified problems, results from the lack of any body of systematic theory to guide the work of reform. Attempts at social progress can't ignore the extent of our ignorance about the causes of complex human phenomena. But the situation isn't hopeless. Thanks to research by social psychologists, sociologists, and economists, some things are known about the role of imaginative play in the development of young children, about differences in children's attitudes across socioeconomic classes, and about the effects on later life of early interventions. I'll stop with 3 examples. The scraps of information available can be supplemented by educational experiments, potentially on a far broader scale than societies have ever attempted. Surveying the experiments of the past, educational policymakers can try to build on what has worked. Human life was once much simpler. All human societies, and possibly many pre-human societies, have fashioned procedures through which younger generations might continue their communal life. The children must learn the skills required of adults in coping with the physical and social environment. Most of the human past has been dominated by programs I'll call basic training. Once infancy has ended, the young are taught to carry out the fundamental tasks of finding food and water, of constructing and maintaining shelter, and of defending against predation. But matters changed decisively with the invention of writing. Scribes needed to learn how to keep the records, and thus required a special education, one that passed from the private sphere of the family into centralized social control. The school was born. But what the school has been expected to do and the population it's been supposed to train have varied substantially with the changing circumstances of human life. Appreciating educational systems as efforts at adapting to a social environment and outgrowths of general socialization suggests some guidelines for educational theory. First, Consider possibilities of social change outside of the formal systems of education and different ways of distributing educational effort. Second, we might rethink the distribution of episodes of learning across the human lifespan. There's so much, why must it all come at once? Third, in diagnosing educational deficiencies, it's worth scrutinizing the social ideals that are said to be in danger. America, does it really need to be made great again? And the constraints they are supposed to generate. I want to apply these proposals to our current situation by focusing on the forms of labor for which American children are supposed to be prepared. It's a truth, not universally acknowledged, but at least widely accepted, that the labor market is changing. Discontented workers and frustrated job seekers look back nostalgically at familiar opportunities that seem to be vanishing, and politicians nourish their nostalgia. Workers' complaints are based on a vision of what the demands and the rewards of the workplace ought to be. Anyone gripped by that vision easily forgets the harsh origins of the work environment whose preservation is now longed for. They overlook the social transformation, including the educational changes that have made it something whose passing is to be resisted or to be regretted. At different phases of the Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Dewey all expressed the same concern about the predicament of the worker as the division of labor intensifies. Here's Smith's version. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too are the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Smith was talking about factory work in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. So how did the factory and the pit become places where people wanted to work? Writing in the 20th century, Dewey saw how acceptability came as the consequence of an economic bargain. He begins by reiterating Smith's point. Machine industry, moreover, tends to reduce great numbers of men to a level where their work becomes mechanical and servile. Work loses its intellectual and aesthetic cast and becomes a mere necessity to procure the pay which buys daily support. And not just daily support. Increased productivity furnished goods at lower prices. As the effects of 19th century industrial practices documented by Marx and Engels were softened by reform movements and the rise of unions, the dreariness of daily life in the factory was offset by the goodies distributed for leisure time enjoyment. Despite Dewey's urgings for pedagogical reforms aimed at enhancing children's growth as individuals, the school and university system came to serve as an institution in which all were to acquire the basic skills needed for 20th century industrial life. It was also to be a place in which young people with special talents were to be selected in rigorous competition. As the 20th century wore on, growing prosperity allowed significant numbers of students, even from poorer families and from marginalized groups, to aspire to higher education and the more interesting, better paying jobs it might bring. 21st century nostalgia for the assembly line rests on the compensations once offered in exchange for 7 hours or so of tedium. A living wage, pleasure of consumption in leisure time, and the chance to see children enjoying richer lives. For several decades now, wages have been stagnant. As recent international comparisons reveal, social mobility in the United States is significantly lower than in many other developed countries. Not only does the US rank with Britain, France, and Italy at the bottom in a survey of 16 affluent countries, its lack of social mobility combines with very high, unusually high levels of inequality among socioeconomic classes. For large parts of the American population, the promises or bribes offered to the workers appear faded and unconvincing. As parents struggle to maintain their families, Their children are disadvantaged in the competitive struggle they encounter in the educational system. Hope is eroded. Alienation begins at school. Economists today recognize the forces shifting the labor market. Technology already makes it possible for many tasks that used to be performed domestically to be carried out more cheaply in distant places. Artificial intelligence and robotics promise to make many human jobs redundant. Global competition favors a continued flow of employment to countries where labor is plentiful and wages are low. We might react by trying to turn our country into South Korea on steroids, or we might think systematically about the lives our children deserve. What jobs are left when production lines migrate to parts of the world in which people desperate for basic economic support are willing to work for wages Americans would never accept? What can a high school graduate do when local factories are filled with many more robots and many less people? When forms of labor disappear to distant places or are taken over by machines, the remaining jobs are likely to be those that can't efficiently be exported or automated. Why isn't this shift cause for celebration? Tasks that resist assignment to machines would appear to be just the ones calling on distinctive human capacities and talents. Whatever sympathy and fellow feeling are required, artificial intelligence seems to fall short. Moreover, for many of the human contacts people need most, the providers have to be local. It wouldn't be a good idea to try to run the Cleveland Fire Department out of Bangladesh, and the machines at your hospital bedside are not equipped to deliver the relaxing touch or the encouraging smile that keeps you going. An obvious retort: to focus on firefighting and nursing paints a rosy picture of service work. Most jobs in which some people serve others are menial, tedious, and unrewarding, both personally and financially. The workers who regret the loss of opportunities for productive labor, paradigmatically factory jobs, rightly resist being offered only degrading tasks at low pay. But surveys of job satisfaction among American workers present an interestingly mixed picture. Service positions, including not only nurses and physicians, firefighters and teachers, but also receptionists, gardeners, and flight attendants, occur high up, even at the top of the satisfaction scale. At the same time, other service occupations, like janitors and fast food servers, are widely viewed as unsatisfying. The bifurcation is hardly surprising. If the pay is low and the status accorded to the work is minimal, indeed, if the jobs are seen as suited to people who have little talent and who are only capable of performing the most elementary tasks, those compelled to make their living in this way are likely to view themselves as condemned to drudgery. Interestingly, some low-paying, low-status jobs are not resented. Those who work at daycare centers often enjoy their work. An occupation can be redeemed by the human contacts it affords, interactions with very young children, say, or the warm gratitude expressed by parents. No human exchange relieves the shift of the janitor alone in an office building after hours. For the server at the fast food counter, there are interactions aplenty, but they are typically curt and often unpleasant. Moreover, as the service economy is currently evolving, some sectors have abandoned the protections occupations have traditionally provided. Shop assistants today may be on call, required to come in on short notice, and even turn back once they have answered the summons. The last virtue of work, its underwriting the capacity for self-sustaining, is eroding. Yet all these negative features of service work are contingent. The dignity of factory labor didn't blossom from any intrinsic quality of the work or from appreciation of the merits of the people who undertook it. Higher status was an achievement. Suppose our society were to accept a future in which many, perhaps even most, occupations would be service jobs. Regulations might be introduced to transform the forms of labor at the low end of the satisfaction scales so that they took on some features of the most satisfying forms of service. That might reasonably start with a living wage and protections to avoid the imperious summoning and dismissal of the servants. It might continue by introducing space for creativity and problem solving, by fostering rewarding interactions with those who are served, and emphasizing the importance of the work done and the qualities of those who do it. If some tasks, solitary work in depressing or noxious environments, say, resist these forms of amelioration, they could be combined with other more rewarding positions through which workers might rotate. Suppose that service work is the future of labor in our country. How should formal education adapt to it? Domestic automation and global outsourcing will provide the United States with a pool of workers whose service could make all our lives go better. Furthermore, the work they could perform could be central to the life plans and to the sense of living meaningfully of those who serve. Among the most rewarding occupations are those centered on relieving the pains of others. Treating and healing respond to adverse situations. The rewards they bring are paralleled by the activity of contributing positively. Fostering lives is as rewarding as saving them. The teacher stands with the nurse and the doctor. An aging population would surely benefit from a dedicated army of caregivers, well paid and well respected, who help the old decline with dignity. But even more important is to nurture our young, all of them. So my first and most basic proposal for education calls for a massive, and I mean massive, expansion of labor in the field of human growth, conceived as beginning at birth and extending into adult life. So, education should be viewed as a central mission of American society, if not the central mission, so that the workforce engaged in it should be dramatically increased. The increase in human investment should be accompanied by the devotion of resources so as to enable the work of the educators. How great should the increase be? Enough to provide each child with adequate chances of living a fulfilling life as a democratic citizen, able to sustain herself or himself in the ambient environment. If service occupations dominate the labor market, the child will need to acquire the characteristics required not only to engage in these occupations, but to fulfill himself or herself through them. As I'll suggest next time, this requires the development of a kind of other-directedness that promises to bring the 3 million goals into closer harmony with one another. For the present, however, a proposal for adapting education to a labor environment in which service occupations dominate can be presented in a simple and provocative way. The task of the education system is to prepare the students to become educators. I hope this will provoke accusations of circularity. How can the function of a system be to replicate itself? But when the question is posed straightforwardly, Darwin taught us how to answer it. That's life. Or to elaborate more philosophically, human lives obtain their meaning through their contribution to the human project, through positive impacts on other lives. It doesn't matter that those further lives will gain their meaning from contributions of the same kind, or that the chain will ultimately terminate. Emerson appreciates the point in the line I chose as my epigraph. The main enterprise of the world, for splendor, for extent, is the upbuilding of a man. In case that sounds too highfalutin by half, let me bring it down to earth. A Pew survey on job satisfaction posed an important question. Which of the following statements best describes how important your family is to you at this time? The most important element of my life, one of the most important elements, but not the most important, not an important element of my life. So before I put up the figures, guess how they were distributed. 76% of those surveyed saw the family as the most important element. A further 22% took it to be one of the most important, but not the most important. Only 2% of those asked the question thought that the sustained well-being of the people who were their kin was not a major determinant of how well their lives were going. So my proposal suggests a direction for finding self-fulfillment in the post-industrial work environment. Extrapolating from the Pew survey, I conjecture that many of those now nostalgic for the labor market of the past are concerned about the financial rewards of a service economy precisely because their lives have been centered on the welfare of their families. The alienation Marx discerned in the industrial conditions of the 19th century was not removed by the developments of the 20th century. Rather, the worker was given a new sense of the welfare of the family, defined in terms of enjoyment of consumer goods and promises of upward mobility and a better future for the children. As wages rose to bring that kind of welfare within reach, trading the workday for a chance to support and advance a family, seen as the most important thing in life, came to seem a good bargain. Service jobs, precarious, low-paying, and demeaning, appear to erode that chance. But remove those features and the threat evaporates. In addition, a service economy might directly reduce Marxian alienation, bringing into the daily work those human aspects of cooperation and mutual benefit that pervade family life, and broadening the communities within which workers are embedded. The bargain is willingly made by many teachers who settle for fewer consumer goods in exchange for the ability to exercise what Marx called the human functions in the workplace. How then to translate my first two proposals into educational reform? As I've already admitted, in the absence of systematic theory, the approach has to be experimental. So I make proposals for experiments. One proposal can draw on empirical research that's already been done. Set up well-designed and well-funded cooperative centers of care, play, and instruction in which children can be enrolled from infancy until the beginning of school. Make the staff-to-child ratio no less than 1 to 5 at any time in the later years and no less than 1 to 2 for infants. Parents should have the opportunity for paid release from their regular work to spend 1 or 2 days per week participating in their children's development at these centers. Each American child should be guaranteed a place at zero cost. The centers would be modeled on those existing nursery schools which currently receive the highest rates of parental approval. They would, however, explicitly resist attempts to help children get ahead, emphasizing cooperation, joint planning, and imaginative play. The staff would take stock of and respond to the development of each child. That's why you need such a good ratio of adults to kids. For children ready to begin learning the formal skills of the school curriculum, help and support would be provided, but acquiring those skills would not be viewed as overriding, a goal to be achieved come what may. And the boundary between elementary school and home should remain permeable. During the early grades, parents should continue to spend 1 or 2 days a week participating in the education of their children, with this activity being viewed as a part of their jobs. The elementary school classroom should contain no more than 15 students and at least 2 teachers. Besides the teachers, at least 1 other adult assistant, possibly many more. Possibly a parent would be present. Curriculum would cover reading, writing, and arithmetic, 21st century basic training. Emphasis on cooperative activity and joint planning should continue. Through interactions with adults possessing a wide range of talents and interests, children would be encouraged to find areas of knowledge, of physical activity, and of art that especially appealed to them. The vision of the elementary school behind this proposal is to stimulate curiosity, enabling each child to discover his or her own passions. Autonomy, as conceived by the liberal approach, turns on self-discovery. You can't find your own place of life without some sense both of who you are and of what possibilities are available. If a diverse collection of adults bring into the classroom their own deeply felt conceptions of what's valuable and worth pursuing, the chances that children might find a range of possibilities for themselves are increased. And through finding a set of initially attractive options, they're then more likely to arrive at one that retains its charm, despite the discipline and the setbacks encountered in its pursuit. The provocation of my early proposal to turn students into educators now takes on new significance. Parents are expected to bring something as educators, not only to their own children, but to the wider community. Moreover, even those without children of their own should bring their passions and intensity and interests to the elementary classroom. The aim of their own past education is to help them find something they want to bring. Through the leanings they acquired in their youth, perhaps in the classrooms that they attended, they discovered their own prospective self-fulfillment, and they partially realized their self-fulfillment by offering it to others. Yet why should it all happen in those early years? One of my guidelines recommends thinking of learning as a lifetime activity. So in accordance with my first guideline, I envisage a further social change in the conditions of work. Workers should have the opportunity and the option of taking a periodic paid leave to attend a center designed to allow adults to pursue activities to enlarge their intellectual, artistic, or physical horizons. This proposal is motivated by studies showing the value of renewal. The patterns of our lives are rarely decided once and for all at some moment of epiphany in adolescence or young adulthood. Our educational system should allow for growth and change. Now, there are many specific questions I've left unaddressed. Some of them I'll take up in the next 2 lectures. But for now, my goal has been to outline ways in which the work environment and the formal educational system might adapt to one another, without economic constraints forcing the issue in a particular direction. Instead of traveling the road to Seoul, South Korea, we should find the road to Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with that, I will turn to the audience for comments or questions. I'll bring you the microphone so you can be heard. This is how I get my exercise.
Thank you. That was a very stimulating talk. I had a question, a couple of different questions, but one question in particular was a lot of your proposals, or your proposals in general, seem to rest on a conception of what people like and what people want, right? Your evidence that you cited for this sense of what people want tends to rely on things like surveys. You cited a number of surveys, yep. Which, as the last election should show us, right, is a seriously flawed mode, especially in a humanistic setting, kind of evidence. And so this leads me to a question, which is, what about kinds of goods or kinds of human desires that seem to be left out of your model? For example, you place great emphasis on cooperation and, yep, on removing the idea of getting ahead and so forth, and refer to surveys showing that family satisfaction is of prime importance. It strikes me as not unlikely that other kinds of goods, for example, relative status, right, within a group. There's anthropological reasons to think that's quite important, as well as medical data that shows that men, for example, in high relative status live longer and thrive in ways that men in lower status don't. So how would you take account of those kinds of goods?
So it's an excellent question. I can't claim that the surveys to which I've gone are in any way definitive, but as I said, we can only experiment. I wouldn't recommend bringing these proposals, as it were, into the entire American educational establishment. I guess it would seem to me a good idea to try them in a few places and see what happened, and to see whether whether the results that seem to be indicated by the surveys held up. So, I mean, with an experiment, you start, you tinker, you experiment some more. You don't give up if things immediately go wrong. I mean, I didn't refute most of the laws of optics when I was asked to do physics experiments in high school. I was incredibly bad at all forms of practical experimentation. No, I was told to go back and try it again. So I think what we should do is have some serious experimentation with these kinds of proposals. I mean, with respect to, of course, to the impact of various, early programs for young children, there is good data, and it has been well analyzed, and the effects and the non-effects are now quite well confirmed. But you're completely right. All of that's fallible. So that's the first of your points. The second of your points goes to this issue about the extent to which sort of nasty and subversive kinds of things for the values I want to promote are in some way built in. And one very strong way of putting that is to say, well, it's actually it's sort of an intrinsic part of human nature somehow, that however much we modify the environment, including the educational environment, people are always going to compare themselves with others, and they're always going to get a high if they're at the top and a low if they're at the bottom. I think we don't know the answers to those kinds of questions any more than we know the answers to the questions about how to, how to facilitate education. And I'm a thorough Deweyan here. I want to be completely experimental. So we play with the environment. We see what can be done. I mean, cooperative and harmonious living among citizens in a society is such a valuable thing that we shouldn't just, as it were, sit down in a funk and give up on it and say, well, we can never achieve it because people are always going to want to compete with one another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting that there are some experiments that suggest that you can do much more. For example, the Finnish system, educational system, which, like the Korean system, is very highly ranked, places a huge emphasis on cooperation in the classroom and in students helping one another. And that seems to play a role in subsequent Finnish attitudes in adult life. So I'm not convinced that you can, as it were, build wonderful, cooperative, golden rule human beings, but I'm willing to give it a try to see how far we can push in this direction. What I will say on Wednesday about the character of democracy and its relation to education comes into play here. Because just as I've tried today to give a diagnosis of the difficulties in thinking about education and some of the potential deficiencies in American education, I want to spend some time on Wednesday in thinking about the concept of democracy and how it has failed in the United States. There was a wonderful slip, I'm not sure if it was a slip in Peter's introduction, about whether we still live in a democracy, and that's actually a question that I think we need to raise. And so if we are to have a democracy, I think we need to get beyond the kind of competitiveness that you think may be a permanent feature of the human condition. And I think also maybe, but that we should try to see the extent to which we can modify. Okay.
This is something of an observation, specifically regarding the circular logic of educating children to become educators themselves. I don't think circular logic is necessarily a problem as long as it's moving in a certain direction. Specifically, comparing it to the Darwin example where, you're going to live your life and you raise your children to live their lives as well, it seems as though, in my mind, humanity is defined by the fact that we make progress over generations. Yes, when I maybe eventually have kids, I'm going to raise them to live their lives, but the hope is going to be that their lives are going to be different, specifically better, than mine, and that progress will occur. It seems as though, at least in the specific wording of educating children to be educators, you're limiting the purview of what people are looking at, and in so doing, kind of restricting what I believe to be the fundamental human virtue of making progress and expanding horizons. So I'm just kind of curious to hear a response.
Okay, that's good. I think you're completely right. And perhaps my formulation needs some amending here, because what I actually had in mind was, as it were, each generation bringing ever greater richness to the one, the one that's coming into being. So the thought not of a static situation where, all that education does is to bring the wisdom of the past to finished and complete to the classroom, but rather it brings all sorts of possibilities for renewal and for going on and for striking out in new ways. I mean, when I talk about the arts in my third lecture, I shall want to emphasize this. But you're completely correct. I mean, what makes our lives fulfilling is the thought that we have, as it were, contributed something that has made perhaps the next generation of lives go better. Maybe in a small scale, for some very talented people on a very large scale. They do something that produces an enormous effect on future generations. They write a masterpiece, they invent a new code of justice, they discover, the theory of relativity or something like that. Those are all, for most of us, that's not on the cards. But we do it in smaller ways, and those smaller things are important. And as you rightly pointed out, they can be cumulative, and that gives us a kind of a feeling of progressiveness. If I'd had much longer, I would have talked explicitly about the concept of progress in this lecture. That's one of the bits that got cut out. So thank you. I mean, I think you saw something quite right.
And you mentioned a couple times in your lecture today, barring any economic constraints. All of your proposals were hinged on the concept of the fact that there were no economic constraints. In a world of capitalism, in a world where money will never not be an issue, how would you intend to address these issues?
Okay, so I'm gonna actually go back to something that occurred in the early 19th century. So in the early 19th century, politicians and economists were absolutely petrified of the idea of what they called the stationary state. The stationary state is something where, productivity sort of comes asymptotically to a limit, right? And at that point, they thought, this is going to be a complete crisis. Mill, with whom I started, wrote actually rather brilliantly about this. He said, look, we shouldn't be afraid of the stationary state. I mean, what we need is the ability to support, in the end, the ability to support human life in a way that will allow the kind of continual cultural progress that the last speaker pointed to. And that doesn't necessarily require greater productivity. So Adam Smith's vision, which has been taken up, of course, in neoclassical economics, is that, when you get greater productivity, that's got to be fed back into the system to secure even, greater productivity. But various people, including various economists, have reacted to this by saying, look, when you've got greater productivity, there's a big question about how much you plow back in to, as it were, trying to increase productivity still further, and how much you use to emancipate human lives from the forms of drudgery that they have been subject to for most of human history. And I'm with Mill and a number of other people who want to say we should think very seriously about the imperative of, as it were, reinvestment. And by the way, it's not so obvious that investing, as it were, in your human capital and in your creativity is necessarily going to detract from productivity. That's another experiment we haven't done, right? So I'm going to eventually want to talk a little bit more about economics, but I would rather leave it there in response to your question. Your question is, in a sense, the straightforward question. You're talking about something that has enormous costs, and so you're going to divert a very large amount of, as it were, the resources that come out of production into what Adam Smith and his contemporaries would have called unproductive labor, by which they meant people like doctors. Doctors are unproductive labor. They don't produce anything. Teachers are unproductive labor. They don't produce anything either. And I'm basically, with Mill, asking the question, well, what's it all for anyway? And suggesting that the answer to the roboticization of the world might be, yippee, now we can really concentrate on the things that matter.
So as we talk about the formal education and the educational systems that have been built within society, how do you envision the informal education system and culture changing alongside with these proposals? And better yet, is there anything that we can do on the informal side pertaining to education even as we try these proposals?
Yeah, okay, so that's really the territory that I want to explore on Wednesday, because I do see the informal systems of education and the informal interchange among citizens as being, the educational interchange among citizens as being central to democracy. So I want to say that, yes, those things have to be fostered, and they have to be fostered through the rebuilding of democratic institutions of a very particular kind. And I don't want to steal my thunder by giving you more detail about that, but I do indeed think that these informal systems are extremely important. And I think that actually the specific character of the evolution of the educational system, as it were, in response to fixed economic factors, has led to the withering of the informal institutions. So you might say, you might characterize the theme of my entire lecture in a single sentence. It's suggesting that instead of thinking of there being this external environment, physical and especially social, to which the educational system has to adapt, we should rather try to seek a way of modifying both so that they exist in some sort of greater harmony. And I'm very much struck. I mean, much of the work that lies behind this lecture has been fostered by reading in the history of education and noting the extraordinary differences in educational systems at different times and the ways in which changes have been dictated by factors that are completely irrelevant to the well-being of the educated, right? It's all happened, as it were, externally and blindly. And so what I'm really calling for is let the potential people who will be benefited by this speak or speak for them. You know, don't have the educational system imposed upon them from the outside, but rather try to see what they need, fallible though it may be, as was pointed out in the first question. My claims about that are fallible, but try to see if you can, as it were, push back and create a harmony between these two things. So this is tricky, and it requires thinking about both the formal educational system and the informal educational system, I think, in connection with democracy. And I'll say no more till Wednesday.
We have time for one more question before we invite you out into the foyer to enjoy some refreshments and continue the conversation informally.
Thanks for your talk. When people focus on the service economy and on caregiving, I'm curious about how they think, and how, in this case, you think about a number of problems that arise within capitalism around this. So the one is the problem of emotional labor being extremely draining on people who do it. The other one has to do with the way that agreeableness of some form, you could specify it, starts to become commodified and suppresses other aspects of relationships that are very important, like the ability to work through conflict, the ability to be authentic, I don't know, other things like that. So insofar as you're focusing on the service economy and on the caregiving economy in one of your examples, how do you think about these negative dimensions of the way the service economy and the caregiving economy functions in our system right now?
Well, I think it's a highly mixed picture. I mean, one thing so I worked on this with an economist actually, who is there's a labor economist at MIT called David Autor, who is often quoted on matters of the way in which the labor market is shifting, and so we thought a lot together about what the surveys show and one thing that's really surprising is that there are quite a lot of service occupations in which the people report quite high job satisfaction. They're not particularly prestigious ones. I mean, flight attendants, so that really surprised me. Receptionists in some businesses, it depends on who the boss is, what the office is like, and I mean, you can well imagine what kinds of variables come into play or don't come into play. So I think that there's a tendency, if I followed your remarks, actually to homogenize something that is quite variegated. So the question is really not how to relieve the commodification of the service economy. It's really how to make the service jobs that are necessary and really disliked more like the ones that are necessary and liked. And I do think that look, the most basic thing in all of this is I think, a very straightforward observation. The situation of the industrial workers in Manchester, so brilliantly described by Engels, right? Or the situation of the miners in the north of England, so brilliantly described by George Orwell. I mean, these are not dignified forms of labor. And as Marx and Smith and Dewey all saw, they're profoundly alienating. And yet people want them not to disappear. Now, why is that? Well, the first and most obvious thing is they've got this focus on something else in their life, and the job can be seen as a means to that, as long as it meets certain conditions. That's a contingent feature, and that can be changed. That surely is a social change that we can make. And with respect to the truly unpleasant things, well, you do what you do when you have groups of people who are working together, say at a camp or in a family or something like that. You have a rota for the jobs, and everybody gets to do the nasty ones once in a while, and nobody gets stuck with them all the time. So, I mean, it seems to me there are ways of trying to solve this problem, but the problem needs to be, I think, posed not at the outset in terms of some sort of entity called service labor that has been somehow commodified by something called capitalism. I mean, capitalism itself incredibly varied, and you might see me as trying to get rid of certain kinds of features of capitalism, but not necessarily as breaking with a market system. I mean, one of the things that I've learned from Alvin Roth's wonderful Nobel lecture is that you can get markets to do lots of different things, and you have to think about what it is you want the market to do, rather than thinking that there's this thing called the market and it's bound to do X. If you want it to do something different from what it's doing, try to rethink the structure of the forces behind the market, and maybe you can get the market to do what you want.
I want to thank you all for being such a wonderful audience, but in particular, I'd like to thank our guest for fueling this conversation, and I hope to see you all back here on Wednesday to hear Professor Kitcher on shaping the citizen. In the meantime, please thank him for tonight's presentation.